Okay, so thanks for coming out tonight, at least virtually, to join us. We have Michelle Giuliano with us tonight. She is an Aetna resident and she runs line by line indexing, where she creates indexes for all kinds of books, including science and medicine books, textbooks and reference books, trade books, but she'll tell us a lot more about that soon. She also has a great website that I think she'll mention, and I can add it to the chat also to link to that, but it has a lot of good information on there. At the end of the talk, there will be a Q&A period where you have time to ask some questions. Also, if you have questions along the way, Michelle doesn't mind if you unmute yourself and ask that, or you can send your question in the chat, and then I can see it and relay it to Michelle. So I think that ends the introduction there. So Michelle, whenever you're ready, you can take it away. Thank you.
Hey, hello everyone. It's great that you guys were all able to join me tonight. I did a bunch of slides, so I'm going to share my screen right away with that if you don't mind. And definitely feel free to just chime in if you have any questions. I'm happy to answer them as I go through the talk. So here we go. There we go. Can everyone see the screen?
Yeah, looks good.
Okay. Perfect. Okay. As Jeff mentioned, I'm Michelle Giuliano. I started line by line indexing in 2015. I had the great opportunity to meet one of my neighbors, Christina Hoskin. I see her out there, so maybe you want to chime in at some point too. And she introduced me to the world of indexing. We actually met at the church book sale. So of course, indexers would meet surrounded by books. So that's just a little bit of brief history of how I got into indexing. I'll get into that more later in the presentation. But first, when I sat down to create this presentation, I was staring at a blank screen. And this is something that I rarely do unless I'm writing about indexing for colleagues or creating a presentation for indexers. So staring at a blank screen was actually a really different process for me. When I'm usually creating for you, the reading public, creating indexes, I start with a finished book. My screen is up with a book that's already been written. The table of contents has been created. I am literally starting at the end of the book publishing process. So creating a presentation for you is quite different. And I didn't really know where to begin. So I started thinking about you. What kind of words would you look up if you were using an index? Because those are the questions. That's a question I would ask myself when I start creating an index. What would you be looking for in a book? How would I lay out the contents of a book in a logical and concise way so that both you who's, if you're reading the book if you've read the book, or if you haven't read the book, how can I help you find what you're looking for? So in thinking about these questions, I realized that I could start by explaining to you, start thinking about the kind of questions that you might ask about this presentation. And so that gave me a starting point, which made me happy because it is hard to create a presentation. So the questions that I'm usually asked when I'm asked, what do you do? And I say I'm an indexer, I usually get, doesn't a computer usually do that? Or do you actually read the whole book? So the spoiler alert here is, yes, a computer can create an index, just not a good one. A computer will usually create a list of words that's in a book, but doesn't put them together in a meaningful way. And a lot of times it'll miss things because it doesn't know that there are different words. There are synonyms that can be used, or sometimes a concept isn't in just a couple of words, it's more of a paragraph that's presenting a concept. So yes, a computer can create an index, but you probably don't want one created by a computer. And yes, I do read every book at least once, but usually 2 to 3 times. And sometimes when it's a really dense medical book, sometimes I have to go through it 4 times. And I'll talk more about this process later. Um, and so a funny thing about indexing that I always like to say um, is that if you want to save money on college, you should encourage your kids to become an indexer. I've received a great liberal arts education indexing books for over 7 years. And I went to a liberal arts college, Swarthmore College. And I have to say, I have a more broad range education from indexing books than I did that I received while I was at Swarthmore, which was a great education. But it's just amazing how much you can accumulate by reading different books. And because I don't always choose the books that I get to index, I'm introduced to a ton of different topics. I have index books on gangster rap. I have index books on in psychiatry and all kinds of books in the medical field. I've done books on the deep ocean, um, on how Nike creates their brand and their designs. So it's just a huge encompassing field. And unlike a writer who might produce a book every couple of years and do a lot of research on it, I index between 60 and 90 books a year. So that's quite a lot of material to get through. And as a full disclosure here, I don't recommend going the route of becoming an indexer to get your college education, because a college education, even an advanced degree, comes in really handy in the indexing world. Again, I'll talk about that more later. And so I'll go on to the next thing now. So now that I've explained a little bit about, how I got into indexing, I'd like to get into a definition of an index. An index is a list of things in order, usually alphabetical. And in the case of a back of the book index, which I think is what people are most familiar with, it's a list of terms, concepts, names, and places where they occur in the book. So an index is a part of a book that can be easily overlooked because it's in the back. But if you're ever looking something up in a book, you know how helpful it can be. So sometimes people think of the index similar to the table of contents. Table of contents is at the beginning of the book, the index is at the back, and so maybe they just sandwich it all together. But the table of contents, while it points to information in the book, it really explains how the book is laid out in order. An index, like I mentioned before, is in alphabetical order. So when you look at a concept under A, the first term might be from the end of the book. It's not in chronological order like the table of contents would be. An index will also group all the instances of a concept or a category or an event or a person all together so you can see where it is located all throughout the book. Well, again, the table of contents is just the book in order and how it's laid out. For example, in a cookbook, if you want to look up broccoli, because you're looking for a recipe that uses broccoli as a main ingredient, you'll go to the back and you'll look under B. If you don't find it, then the book probably doesn't have any recipes with broccoli in it. And so you'll know to go to a different book or search for a different ingredient for a different recipe. Speaking of cookbooks, I want to bring up a really cool website called Eat Your Books. And they've created indexes of all the cookbooks, all the recipes across many, many, many different cookbooks. So you can go in there and create a library of your cookbooks. And so when you look up broccoli, it'll tell you what book and what page number in that book you can find broccoli recipes. And if you have many books with broccoli recipes, they'll all be listed there. And I think that's a really cool and interesting way to use indexes. So now that we talked about what an index is, let's take a look at one. This is an example of an index. It's from a really small index from a book on woodpeckers that I wrote a while ago when I was creating exercises for some of my indexing students. And I'm going to go over the parts of an index, which you probably know, but it's always good to be on the same page. The first thing we'll look at is A, which is called a group letter. Other group letters on this page are B, D, E, and F, and they define the alphabetical sections of an index. But not all indexes contain group letters. Instead, some may use 2 or 3 blank lines to separate the different alphabetical sections. The next thing we'll look at is beechnuts, which is a heading. We have a whole bunch of different headings in this index, and that's the main concepts that we see here. Headings are also called main headings or main entries, and they're concepts, ideas, or terms that are discussed in the text. Typically, they're not capitalized. Sometimes they are capitalized. Depends on the style of the index. And that depends on the publisher or the author, what the author wants to do. And then if we look at the heading Bill, it has 2 subheadings, adaptions and strength of. And some headings are sometimes called subentries. And in this case, 2 subheadings under bills show different aspects of woodpecker's bills, adaption of the bills and the strength of the bills. And then we'll look at a locator, which is called right over here under ant bears, number 56. That shows the page number that you would go to find out more about ant bears. And under downy woodpecker, we have under feeding behavior, which is a subheading, 15 through 17. That's a locator range. And that lets you know that the information on the feeding behavior of downy peckers is discussed from pages 15 to 17. And the discussion is continuous. Something that some people don't really understand in indexes are cross-references. And under the letter E, we have 2 cross-references. And we have the C. Californian woodpeckers. And that, oops, I'm sorry, I went to the wrong ones. Sorry about that. If you, it's telling you that name El Carpintero, that the information for that bird is under Californian woodpecker. And to go there, and that's where you'll find all the information. Sometimes you have what's called a C also cross-reference, and that is under evolution, and that says see also body adaptations. It says, you know, evolution is specifically discussed on pages 38 and 58, but if you want more that might be related to evolution, look at body adaptations and you'll find out more information. It's like, hey, if you're interested in this, go here, you might find this interesting too. Okay, so the last slide was from a book. You know, that one actually wasn't printed in a book. I got that from a book that was in, what is it called? The Common Round, like where they don't have the copyright on it anymore. So that's why I was able to create that index and I felt comfortable showing it to you. But an index can be created from many different types of material. You have film, slides, legislature. An ebook can have an index, and sometimes that index will link to a page with that information on it, and sometimes it's static, and it's the index from a print book, and it doesn't link to anything. Ebooks are tough to have indexes in because every ebook reader will display the information, display the book in a different way depending on how people have set the font on the ebook, the size of the ebook. And so the only way to really create an effective index is to have it linked. And it's not always easy to do that. And the technology really hasn't been made available to make that as useful as it could be. Some textbook designers have done that in a much better way. But what people are finding is that e-textbooks aren't very popular among students. I know a lot of students who are required to buy e-textbooks and then go out and buy the hard copy of it. So ebooks have always been this doom and gloom for indexers. Are we going to be put out of business because there's going to be ebooks out there and you can just search them? But indexing still really has a place because like I explained before, with a computer generated index, it doesn't always do a good job. If you're looking up something like, I'm trying to think of a good example here. Going back to evolution in the previous example, sometimes the term evolution isn't used in the book in a place that discusses evolution. They might have said, and birds have evolved. So if you use evolution as your search term, you might miss that whole discussion about birds. Governments often have a staff of indexers who index legislative sessions and all the papers on their laws. I index proceedings for some medical societies. They need to be able to find information from these sessions quickly. And that's where my index, not a computer search button, comes in handy. Because again, the search button, if you don't know exactly what you're searching for and you know that it's explained in exactly that way, you're not going to find it. But if they want to find all the proceedings that discussed, let's say, privacy, I'll have them all listed in the index under that. Because an indexer can index a concept, their indexes will be much more useful than a search button or a computer generated index, which can only be for specific words. You can also index films or slide presentations. I've indexed thousands and thousands of slides for a medical testing website. Periodical and abstract indexing is very important for journals so that they can you can access things from years ago, recent. Even fiction books and series can be indexed. It's not done very often, which surprises me. I always thought that the popular series like Harry Potter or Lord of the Rings should have an index so people can find where the battles were or all the information about specific characters. It would be a huge undertaking, but it would be a really useful thing. And finally, not on this slide, but I have also index notes and interviews for writers. And I find that to be a really worthwhile thing to do. And what's interesting is I have been told that they like to start with the index of their notes and interviews because it helps them not start with a blank page. So we've kind of come full circle here. I don't like a blank page, and I guess writers don't like to start with a blank page either. So essentially, with an index, I can create a map to information regardless of the form of material that I'm indexing. So how does the index, creating index fit into the publishing process? We're last in line. If deadlines slide and things like that, we're at the very end and we're kind of pushed to get it done so that everything can move on. So indexing is not for the faint of heart. We work under tight deadlines, but we like to get the job done. The only other thing that I'll mention there is also something called embedded indexing. It's not something that I do, but it's an attempt to introduce indexing at the manuscript stage before it's been laid out. So what people do is create an index with little markers that they put in the manuscript that when it gets formatted into the layout that the book will be in, it populates the index. It populates page numbers in the index. It's a slower process, and I'm not sure if they've really mastered how well it can work. And I have avoided doing it. So what kind of qualities or education do you need to become an indexer? I alluded to that earlier. Let's start with the qualities. You need to be able to work well under pressure. Like I mentioned before, we're at the end stage. Sometimes they're like, we're supposed to give you a week and a half, but now you have a week. Can you get it done? You also, in the past, another good quality to have for an indexer was they would tease people and say, if you like to alphabetize your spice cabinet or the books on your bookshelf, you'd make a really good indexer because you have attention to detail and you like things to be in order at all times. And that was because years ago, up until, in fact, the early 90s, most indexers used actual index cards to create indexes. Each entry, so like if you think back to my woodpecker index, each like bird would have its own index card for each of the subheadings that it had, or each mention in the book. And then at the end, they would have to alphabetize and organize all of these index cards, and they would put them into shoe boxes so that they could be in order. And they would either send those shoe boxes to the publisher, or they would then have to type out the index by hand based on all those index cards. I cannot imagine doing that. And I probably wouldn't have become an indexer if I had to do that, because I would find that to be a really overwhelming process. But that's why someone who liked to alphabetize their spice cabinet or their books or their CD, well, they probably didn't have CD collections at that point, their tape cassettes, that would be the kind of person who would excel at it as an indexer. Back then, the FedEx person was the indexer's best friend. That's how an indexer would receive the book and how the index boxes or the final index would be picked up. These days, an indexer still needs to embrace minutia and details, but there's so many computerized programs in place to help make indexing an easier job. You know, we still have to do all the critical thinking and decision making, but our computer programs help with the alphabetization. They help with the different kinds of styles that the publisher wants. And I like technology. I like learning new things. And so I like to keep up with all of that. And so that keeps my job interesting. One interesting characteristic that has dominated indexers for many years is that most come to indexing as a second career. For a long time, a lot of women came into indexing after their kids went off to school. In fact, the US Department of Agriculture, believe it or not, used to teach a correspondence course for women to learn how to index. That's because it was part of the USDA's effort to give farmers and their wives a second income. They felt that indexing would help farmers' wives do something in the winter, or in the midst of their busy days. Hey, why not index as well? But a lot of people learned to index through the USDA's course, and it was a very valuable piece of education for them. Now I'm actually seeing more new indexers right out of college. They take an indexing course during library school, or after they graduate, they do it as an online course, such as one offered from the University of California in Berkeley. And they pick up indexing that way, which I find to be very interesting. In the past, indexers used to learn on the job through a publishing house or through a mentorship. They didn't have to take a course, and you still can learn to index. You don't have to take a course. You can read the books. You can work under another indexer who can help guide you through the process. Now, very, very few publishing houses have employ full-time indexers. It's really a freelance business. I feel that's a shame, because indexing, I feel, is best learned through working with other indexers and having someone who knows the ropes show you the way. Improving your skills as an indexer in a silo as a freelancer can be difficult at best, because you do not get a lot of feedback back from the publisher. And if you do get feedback, it's usually like, oh, you should have done it this way. And we don't get a lot of feedback from our readers either. They would reach out to the publisher to find out, to explain, to let people know whether they were happy or dissatisfied with the index. And very rarely our index is reviewed as part of the book review. And I think it would be great to hear more about what everyone is looking for. And I apologize for my phone ringing. I didn't think to take that off. So I'm going to go to the next screen. So how did I become an indexer? I went to college pre-med and went to medical school. And I actually practiced medicine for almost 10 years, running my own medical practice. My husband and I moved with our young family to the Upper Valley, and I took what I thought would be a brief sabbatical from practicing medicine. That sabbatical extended longer than I thought when my husband started working at Mount Scottney Hospital. And I had actually ended up homeschooling my own kids. But my neighbor, Christine, hi, Christine. I met her at a book sale, like I mentioned earlier. And she told me all about her job, and I found her job to be fascinating. And so I decided, like, how can I become an indexer? She helped guide me through the process. She was always a great source of information. And after about a year and a half, I became an indexer. As a doctor and as a resident, what worked for me was the old adage, see one, do one, teach one. So I didn't feel comfortable starting out just on my own indexing. So I sought out a mentorship relationship. And so I worked with another indexer at a distance. We did everything through email for 3 years, and I worked on my indexing skills. And I found that to be very valuable. She specialized in law and public policy, which was really outside my wheelhouse because I thought I'd do mostly medical indexing. But that really helped me learn how to process the details of indexing in a very different way. And I am forever grateful to have had that kind of education. So that's how I became an indexer. And what's the next thing? And as I joked earlier, that indexing has given me a great liberal arts education. So do I feel that my educational and professional background was necessary for indexing? And I would say yes and no. I feel like I am getting a great education and really expanding my knowledge and skills through indexing. But I also feel my education allowed me to become a better indexer. It's always good to have a background in what you're indexing. I couldn't have indexed law and public policy if I didn't have someone who is already a very, very skilled indexer lead me through that kind of work. But when I sat down to do medical indexing, that kind of work came easy, and my mentor could help overlay the proper skills of indexing on top of that. So like a lot of people in academia like to specialize in what they got their PhD, and there are lots of indexers who have their PhD or their master's. And whether it's in gender studies or history or psychology, they can really bring a lot to those particular fields. But a good indexer who has a lot of experience can still produce a really good index outside their wheelhouse. And then there's indexers who are generalists versus specialists. You could say that I specialize in medical and science indexing, but I do a lot of other indexing just because I like to keep it interesting. So I consider myself a generalist with a specialization because I work with a wide range of subjects and a wide range of materials, slides, medical proceedings, trade books, textbooks, interviews. But I specialize in medical indexing, which some people just don't like to touch. So I can talk real briefly about how you create an index. My indexing process is probably different than other people's indexing process because we all have a different way we like to approach things. Mine is completely paperless. Before back with the index cards, you'd get the big book and you'd have all the papers, and some people still really like to index from paper, from a paper copy of the book. I don't. I like to use a PDF program because I can mark it up. But to be paperless, I have to use 5 separate software programs. I have a really big monitor that allows me to run several different software programs at once, which helps make indexing easier for me. I have a program for running macros. If you're not familiar with macros, it allows you to use like just two keys to, you press two keys and then I can do this complex process of, several things at once. For example, I can hit two keys after I highlight a term in my PDF. And if it's a name, it'll take that name, copy it, and then paste it into my indexing software, and then flip the name around. So the last name is before the first name. And then it'll go to the page section of my indexing software. So I then can enter the page number. So with two hits of the keys, I can index a really long name and not have to worry about having a spelling error because I used a macro. I use specialized indexing software. There are several different kinds of indexing software, and you just kind of pick and choose what you like. I use a PDF program for to display and mark up my book. A lot of people use Adobe. I happen to use something called PDF Exchange from Tracker Software because I just like that software a lot better. I use Microsoft Word to produce the final copy of the index because that's what publishers like to use to input into their software that they use to lay out the index at the end of the book. And I also use a PDF program for an iPad. It's called PDF Expert, and that allows me to annotate my PDF. And that's what I do. That's my first stage of indexing. First thing I do when I get a PDF is I trim it. Sometimes you have to crop the pages. Sometimes you have to rearrange the pages because I like to have the first page be number 1. So I take out the table of contents and move that to the end of the book. And the same thing with the introduction. So that takes 1 to 5% of my project time. And I usually mark up, I do sections for page ranges and things like that. And indexing takes about 70% of the project time. You can mark up the text on the iPad or in the PDF program. Sometimes you need to do that, sometimes you don't. And the next thing I do is I create the spine structure of the index. And that is, what is the book about? What are the main concepts? And it allows me to have a structure. It's like the skeleton that I can then build off of. You can add different pieces in different places that help really give you a good structure for the index. And then the next stage I pick up all the relevant names, places, events, legislation, and the final stage, and this could be my 3rd time through the book, that's when I pick up the concepts and the other details. And I like doing that at the end because I feel like I've seen the material and it helps me not to have to go back and review it again. And then the final stage is editing, massaging the index, making sure it reads through well. It has the style that the author wants. It's been spell checked. We spot check for locators, whether the page numbers, are they accurate? We like to think we're perfect, but we're not. So it's really important to the stage, even though it only takes about a quarter of the time, it's a really important stage. I look at the MS Word document on the iPad. I change it to PDF so I can look at it in my PDF software. And then I can make edits by hand using the Apple Pencil, and that's really useful. You make those changes and you review it again. And this is where I still think it would be really nice to be working within the publishing house directly, because then you can have an editor look at it again for things. I have found over the years, it actually is helpful to have someone else look at the index one more time for me. And I like that. Again, it lends itself to creating a community of indexers when you have someone else look at your work and you can learn from them as well. And always another set of eyes is great. I thought a little humor in indexing after this long presentation might be a bit of fun. There's a great book out there. It was released last year called Index, A History of the, by Dennis Duncan. He's from the UK, and he wrote obviously a history of the index. And there's a lot of tongue-in-cheek humor in it. And he employed an indexer specifically because he wanted a little bit of back and forth between the book and the index. And one of the jokes that are in the book, um, Dennis Duncan had a computer create an index, and he wanted to compare it to an index, the index that he had the indexer create. And it's a really bad index, and he only displays a few pages of it in the in the uh, in the book. But so a bad concordance to the index of a history index of history of the, it was on page 304 to 307. But the good index that the indexer wrote was on page 309 to 340. So that was kind of their little tongue-in-cheek joke in there. And then another one was an entry to a very big book, Williams Obstetrics, the 16th edition in 1980. And there was a line in there, chauvinism male voluminous amount, that contained the whole thing through the book, because back then, you know, obstetrics was a male dominated field for female care. And at the time, the tone of the book was rather condescending, and assuming a woman wrote this, and was she a mad indexer and got her revenge? Perhaps she did, because she also had a few other things in there. And residents who had to study this book late at night often found humor in these kinds of things. So I thought I'd finish off the presentation, the formal part of this presentation, with how does the future of indexing look? You know, maybe this presentation has, you know, spurred you to say, hey, this sounds like something I would love to do. You know, is there doom and gloom in the future? Is the print book dead? Are we going to have computer generated indexes? How is artificial intelligence? Is that going to replace the indexer? Well, we've been predicting this kind of doom and gloom for years, years and years and years, and it hasn't happened yet. Even textbooks that are in ebook form haven't really, they've gained traction because a lot of colleges or schools like them because they're, you know, environmentally friendly, but students aren't learning as well as they'd like from them. So I think the future for indexing is bright. So if you're interested in indexing, I wouldn't let any doom and gloom predictions, you know, make you want to shy away from that. But if the print book does die, just remember there's so many other parts of indexing. Even without the book, you can index films, slides, law, you know, periodical and abstract indexing. That's rising again. Fiction books, you know, the ebooks will get better with indexing. So there's always going to be a role for an indexer, I feel. And essentially, as I mentioned before, with an index, I create a map to information regardless of its source. And the other thing I realized I did not put on this slide was you can index websites, which is another whole, you know, specialization in indexing. So I'm going to head back to this slide and see if there's any questions out there. Does anyone have any questions? I will stop sharing my screen.
Michelle, we do have one question in the chat right now.
Okay.
Catherine wanted to know, do you ever have to do additional reading to better understand subjects which you're not familiar with? So I think like reading books outside of the book you're indexing to get some background information on a subject, maybe?
Yes, yes, there have been times I've had to do that. You know, sometimes the way the author presented the information might be a little over my head. So I make sure that I understand it fully before I embark on it. I did remember when I did, like, for example, the gangster rap history, it was fascinating, but there were certain things I didn't understand the relationships between certain rappers. And I made sure I understood that properly before so I could index the information properly, because the author assumed a lot of um, people who would be reading the book understood who everyone was and how they were interrelated. And I made sure I had those relationships down before I committed anything into the index.
And Michelle, I was wondering, when you finish the process and send it off to the publisher, does the publisher, or I don't know how often the author sees it, do they ever get back to you and ask for changes or additions or anything?
Sometimes they do. Sometimes it happens more with scholarly books, which I don't do a lot of. And you work with the author and they envision certain things and they want you to go back and make those changes. Sometimes you have to shorten the index because they realize they didn't have quite as much space as they thought. So you have to go back and figure out how you're going to, what to take out, what's useful to take out. So you don't have a whole, usually since it's at the end of the process, there's not a lot of time for that.
Great. And speaking of time, Emma had a question in the chat also. She said, I'm sure this varies wildly depending on the size of the book, but how long would you say it takes to complete an indexing project?
You're right, it does vary widely. I have done some trade books in under 10 hours, and some dense medical textbooks can take as many as 40 hours if they're really long. What I do, part of the process of being a freelancer, is you have to make sure your rates match what you should be making an hour. And indexers don't charge by the hour. We usually charge by the page or the project. And sometimes you charge by the word or the entry. And so I keep good track. I really keep very rigid records of my time. And sometimes you're like, oh, this index is taking forever. I'm miserable. This material just doesn't interest me. And then you realize, oh, took a lot less time than I thought it would. In other books, I love horses, and I do some equestrian indexing. And those books, even if they take me longer than they should, I don't mind, because I really enjoy the material and I can get very involved in it.
Catherine has another question in chat. Do you ever talk directly to an author?
Yes, yes. It depends on the author. Like I have one book that comes to mind was a book that I did on the founding of Wake Forest University. She wanted to hire me because she knew I lived in the area that one of the founders was her great 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 grandmother, and she knew I knew the area that her grandmother was from, which was in Vermont, and I lived in that area for 10 years. And so we had a lot of back and forth on that, and that was interesting. And sometimes with local authors, you even get to meet them, which is really fun, and I did that recently. Anything else?
I was also wondering, there's definitely some parallels between indexing and library school, I think, and cataloging books. While I was getting my degree in library studies, I did some cataloging. And I was just wondering about, like, do you guys use like Library of Congress subject headings, or is there like a certain official language you use that you refer to?
Well, when I do the medical proceedings, I do use Medline. I try to stick with their headings because that's what they use a lot of the time in, but typically not necessarily. We might use the Library of Congress to know how to flip names, because some names have multiple names, and what should really be first, what is their true last name. But there are certain kinds of indexing where you do have controlled vocabulary that you have to use. But in the stuff that I do, not very often, except for the medical proceedings. Anything else? Does anyone want to become an indexer now?
Christine does.
Yes, Christine does. She taught me so much of what I've known.
And I think, Michelle, you said that there's even a third indexer kind of living in the neighborhood that.
There used to be in Lyme, and I know Christine, is your aunt still indexing? She's not quite in the neighborhood. She's not far. You can unmute, yes.
Yes, my cousin actually, yep, she's in Chelsea, still indexing, and there's 2 or 3 indexers in Tunbridge, a woman in Lyme, one in Corinth. So there's quite a few indexers right in this vicinity.
Yeah.
Emma had a question. What's a sign for you of a bad index? Is there something that sticks out when you see an index that wasn't written very well?
Well, one of the first signs is something we call undifferentiated locators. It's when you have a name, you know, in the book, let's say Abraham Lincoln, and there's 12 page numbers after him. And sometimes you have to do that because you're not given a lot of room for the book, so you can't break it down to subheadings. But who wants to look up 12 different pages to find out what was said about Abraham Lincoln on those pages? Or a lot of passing mentions. My daughter always brings it up. I remember I looked in a horse book, and for Shetland pony, they had it in there, and it was awful because it said a draft horse is much bigger than a Shetland pony, but it didn't tell me anything about a Shetland pony. And so those are called passing mentions. And if you run into a lot of those, they get annoying in an index. But it's not something you would know just by looking at it.
And Michelle, you mentioned that you are freelance, but that some indexers work like directly for a publishing house. Where do your projects come from? Do you have publishers that you work with a lot, or how do you get your work?
Well, through my website, you know, I get a lot of work from there and referral from clients. You know, when I started out, I would send out letters to different, well, emails to different clients. But I work with a lot of medical associations doing their work. I work for some publishers and some authors. So it comes from a variety of sources. And indexers network a lot. You know, if there's something that they don't do, you refer it to other people.
Okay, and that actually relates to the next question in chat. Jennifer wanted to know if there's an association of indexers, and if so, if you're involved with it.
Yeah, there's actually several associations of indexers. There is the American Society of Indexers, ASI, and they're the United States one. And there's also one in Canada, which is the Indexing Society of Canada, ISC. I actually belong to ISC because I like their programming a little bit better. They have more monthly chats and things like that. So I like to, I belong to that one instead of the American Association. And there's one in England, there's one in South Africa, and there's actually one in China too. Interestingly, French books are not indexed, but German books are, but they don't have their own association. So they often belong to the one in the UK. So just a little global history there.
Another chat question, wondering if indexers get paid well?
Well, that's always a good question. You know, it depends. And you know, it depends on how you manage your business. I think that I have been able over the years to increase my rates to a place where I feel that I'm making a good hourly wage. But you have to, it goes back to, are you watching your time to understand how much you're making, and can you become more efficient at what you do? My mentor always said there are a lot of indexers out there who just work for their pin money, which means they're not trying to make a living at it, but it's just like a little added extra source of income. And, you know, so So it depends on how you want to approach your business. Are you going to approach it like a real business and try to make sure that you're making a living wage?
Great. Any other questions from anyone? Okay, well, thank you so much, Michelle, for your time tonight. Really appreciate it. It's great learning about this. The next Etna Library event will be a conversation with a local author, Michael Diohe, whose recent book is Summit by the Sea. That'll be on October 13th at 6:30 p.m. So information on that and all the other upcoming Etna Library events are on our website at etna-library.org. Please do check out Michelle's website also for some additional information. And yeah, thanks everyone for stopping by and watching tonight. And thank you again, Michelle. I really appreciate it.
Yes. And if anyone has any questions, definitely feel free to email me. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Great. Thank you so much. Good night, everyone.
Good night.